Hi guys, this is your history lesson. We are going to be on page 204, I believe. I believe we finished talking about the Word of God in there. We're going to start with the age of the Puritans. We're going to talk about the age of the Puritans today. Um, so we'll start on 204, almost at the top, age of Puritans, 17th century England. The emphasis on the Bible during the Elizabethan Age, so we're still in the Elizabethan Age, we're coming out of that now, which is when Elizabeth was queen, who is the daughter of King Henry VIII. The emphasis on the Bible during the Elizabethan Age brought in the next great period of English history, the 17th century. So 17th century means the 1600s. We do that with centuries because they call the zeros the first century and the 100s are the second century, like that. So 17th century is the 1600s. And they call the 1600s the Age of the Puritans. As Englishmen studied the Bible, many of them began to feel that England's official church, the Church of England, was still too much like the Roman Catholic Church. They also realized that Christians should live holy lives and not act, dress, or think like the world. This is one of the big things about the Bible, is that the Bible doesn't want us acting like the world. That's what a lot of the law, there's some of the verses in the Bible in the law that we might not understand. Like it says, like, men shouldn't shave the sides of their beard. It's not like, wait a minute, yesterday I just did this. Am I insane right now? First of all, number one, those laws are for Israel, not for modern times. The law, the Mosaic law was for Israel. But secondly, if you look at the context of it, the whole thing was the reason why God didn't want them doing the things is because those are things that the people, the other nations were doing. Like that was probably something one of the nations would do, and in their worship was like shaving the sides of their beard in a certain way, and so God didn't want them to act in the same way as the people in the world, and He didn't want them to worship on a high place. Why? Is there something wrong with hills? No, we can go and climb a mountain and worship God, have a praise song. Sure, that's fine. It's more that's where the world would worship, and so they didn't want them doing that. So here, taking that state of mind, maybe going a little too far with it, the Puritans began to analyze the way people dress and the way people act and think, and say, if it's like the world, we want to do something differently. Now, that in and of itself was fine, that idea, but you have to make sure you don't get legalistic with it. It got extremely legalistic with it and would analyze the way people dressed and stuff like that. Englishmen who felt this way were called Puritans. Okay, so they were a whole group of people that had a big problem with the Church of England. And the people, there were two separate ideas. Like this one group said there's a problem with the Church of England, but they had two different ideas of how to fix it. The group that said they wanted to purify or cleanse the church were called Puritans. The Puritans wanted to purify or fix the Church of England. They wanted to stay in the Church of England but fix the problems with it. Then there was another group called Separatists who said, you know what, it's non-fixable, let's just create our own church. They're called the Separatists. So Puritans wanted to purify the church, Separatists wanted to separate from the church. Puritans wanted to not just purify, but like cleanse it, stay in the church. Separatists didn't. King James I. The king who ruled after Queen Elizabeth I was King James I. He ruled for 22 years. He tried to limit, he was ruled from 1603 to 1625, so he ruled during the time of the Pilgrims, which we're going to talk about. He tried to limit the power of Parliament and the traditional freedoms of Englishmen. So this ended up, being bad. He tried to limit the power of Parliament. Former Parliament is like their Congress, the party who makes laws. He basically tried to take more power for himself, kind of tamp down the Parliament and lift his position up. And in doing so, he is kind of giving himself a little more power, but the people didn't like it. He also tried to force the Puritans out of England. He wanted the Church of England to be what he wanted it, and nobody who wanted to separate from the Church of England or even purify the Church of England should be here. I want to get them out. And so he persecuted the Puritans and Separatists. And God ended up using his persecution of the Puritans and separatists to do something marvelous. Now, it's not that God was like, yes, let's persecute these people. But God can always take something bad, a bad situation, and use something good out of it. And so he began a migration of Bible-believing Englishmen to America. In 1620, during the reign of King James, one group of separatists sailed for the New World from England. Well, they actually went England, then to Holland, then to America, then to the New World. And they became known as Pilgrims. The Pilgrims who landed in Plymouth, 1620. They were originally from England. They were separatists, and the King of England kicked them out. They found a temporary home in Holland, but then we're like, let's just go to the New World. We have freedom of religion there. God also used King James in another special way, to sponsor a new translation of the Bible into the English language. So he was seeing all the success of the English version of the Bible, and it wasn't like he thought it was a great idea. He was just like, all right, you know what? If people are going to be reading the Bible for themselves, let's make sure that we do it the right way, and let's make sure we get a handle on what the Bible says. So they translated the Bible into the King James Version. Sometimes it's called the Authorized Version, in 1611. And now it's the most widely used version of the Bible ever known to man. So God can use even somebody who's not a great guy. King James I wasn't really a great guy, for great things. So, as I said, during King James I's life, he tried to take more power for himself and limit the power of Parliament, which the people really didn't like. They don't like leaders taking too much power. Well, his son, King Charles I, comes next. He rules from 1625 to 1649, and, like his dad before him, he decides to be even harder on Parliament and tamp them down even less and take even more power for himself. And it's really interesting how this correlates to the story of Solomon and Rehoboam, which we're going to talk about. Solomon, was a bit harsh on the people with taxes and everything, and then his son Rehoboam had the chance to be nicer, but he was worse. And what happened was this, the whole country split because of it, and became the northern and southern kingdom. Well, here King Charles decided, I'm going to be even harder than my dad. I'm going to take even more power for myself. And he was harder on the Puritans. During his reign, more than 25,000 Puritans left England for freedom of worship in America. 25,000 people leaving a country. Those are 25,000 people that are no longer really subject to you anymore. Some of those who remained joined with other members of Parliament trying to get King Charles to obey the principles of Magna Carta. They're like, you're not listening to the Magna Carta. What are you doing? You're a tyrant. And soon it got so bad that a civil war broke out in England. So civil war is not, when we think of the Civil War, we think of the American Civil War. But a civil war is just a war within the country. It's civil. Civil means local. It's a local war between two differing parties in the country. In America, it was the North versus the South about slavery and states' rights. The North said slavery isn't right and we're going to make it illegal. And the South said, not just that they wanted slavery to be legal, but they said the whole reason we joined the United States of America less than 100 years ago was because you promised us that we could keep slavery, which again was evil, but they said we didn't want to join the United States. We wanted to stay separate, like the southern states, Georgia, South Carolina, all them. They wanted to stay separate. And then, but all the northern states were like, no, let's come together. And the southern states were like, we're only going to come together though if and fight against England with you guys if you guys let us keep slavery. And they were like, okay, fine, that's fine. We'll keep slavery. A lot of the early founding fathers didn't want it. Like Thomas Jefferson, at least for a time, didn't want slavery. And same with George Washington, even though they ended up owning slaves at one point in time. John Adams was an ardent guy who was against slavery, but they didn't originally want slavery in America, and we had a civil war because they changed their mind. The North said, no, we're done. It has to be done. The South didn't want it to be done. But here, there's a civil war in England about how much power the king should have. And so there were two sides. There were the Cavaliers, who were loyal to the king. The Cavaliers were people who were loyal to King Charles. You can think of the Cavaliers, Cleveland Cavaliers, who used to have LeBron James on them. And King Charles is the son of King James, right? Who knows? And so the Cavaliers were loyal um, to King Charles and said he should be able to have as much power as he wants. And then there were another group of people who thought that the power should remain with Parliament, and they were called the Parliamentarians, or their nickname, which was kind of derogatory, were the Roundheads. They called them the Roundheads. They didn't like to be known as the Roundheads, but they were called the Roundheads. I think it had to do with something with their haircuts, the way that they would typically cut their hair. So again, you have on one side the Cavaliers, loyal to King Charles I, and then you have the Round Parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, who were loyal to, who were against it. And the Roundheads were led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. And so, during the Civil War, they fought against one another, and it was so bad, it was so extreme, that they executed the king. They rounded up King Charles I, and they executed him. The Roundheads did, obviously. And so the Roundheads kind of won this Civil War for a while. And so Oliver Cromwell they need a new leader, and Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Roundheads, comes to power, and he says, I'm going to be the power. I'm going to be in power. And top of 205, the Roundheads set up a new government called the Commonwealth. So they said, we're going to call it the Commonwealth. It's going to be for the people. It's going to be everything. And kind of note what happens here. They were like, we're going to start something brand new. It's going to be all about the people and everything. And Oliver Cromwell was a leader. However, Oliver Cromwell was even worse than King Charles I. He ruled like a dictator and took way, way, way more power for himself. He did give more religious freedom than was previously allowed, which was one of the problems they had with King Charles I. But like everything else, he was way worse. And his son so after Oliver Cromwell died, his son becomes leader after him. But he's not a very good leader. People are pretty much like, yeah, this guy kind of stinks, and we don't really like this system anymore. So they decide to get rid of him and bring King Charles II, who is the son of King Charles I, in and put him on the throne, which at that point in time is called the Restoration, which we're going to talk about at some point. So let me recap for you what happens. So far we've learned King Henry VIII. Then he had no sons, so Queen Elizabeth I was queen. Then she had a very long, very prosperous reign. Then King James I, the son of Queen Elizabeth, comes to the throne. Some good things happen during his reign. The Pilgrims leave or whatever, but he's very he persecutes the religious church a lot, and he very, very adamant that the Church of England makes the rules. And he took more power onto himself, limited the Parliament, so he kind of becomes too powerful. And after his death, his son King Charles I becomes the king, and he takes even more power for himself, and he's hard on the Puritans. People just get sick of it. They rebel, have a civil war, and the Cavaliers are loyal to King Charles I. Roundheads, the parliamentarians, are like, no, let's get back to having Parliament. They execute King Charles I, bring up Oliver Cromwell, their leader, to be the king. He's just terrible. He's a dictator. After his death, his son becomes king for just a very short amount of time, or the leader. They remove him and bring the son of King Charles I, who they had executed, King Charles II. They bring him to the throne, and that's called the Restoration, because they're restoring the monarchy. And so we'll talk about, next time, we're going to talk about some of the literature of the 1600s, and then we'll get into the Restoration, what happens when King Charles II is on the throne. All right, well, that's all of your history for today, and look for a history video again tomorrow. Bye.